This is a review exercise for your chapter M1 and M3 comprehensive assignment. In all, this assignment is going to ask you to go through and prepare the production cost reports for a two-stage manufacturing process. Record the journals related to production and the sale of the produced goods, as well as some other costs that happened within this company. And ultimately, at the end, make your cost of goods manufactured schedule in order to make your income statement. And we need to start from the beginning of the process. So for our company, we're going to be Rewind Recycling that makes storage bins made out of recycled plastic. They have a two-phase production process. They start with the breakdown department where they break down old plastic into, rough plastic that can be molded into bins. And that's what happens in the second phase of production, which is the molding department. So let's start off, get our numbers ready for our journal entries by making the production cost reports for our two different departments. And in our first department, we've got a bunch of information about what we are working with. In the beginning of this month of December 20XX that we are accounting for, the breakdown department had 4,000 bins worth of plastic sitting around waiting to be broken down into recycled plastic that can be used for these bins. There was already costs committed to it in terms of materials and conversion costs, labor and overhead combined. They had those 4,000 units in beginning WIP. They also started 46,000 bins worth of plastic, breaking it down from scratch during the period. And all in all, during this month of December, the breakdown department completed recycling enough plastic to be made into 45,000 bins, which they transferred off the molding to be finished. And there's still 5,000 bins worth of plastic that's being processed within this department. We have the costs that they added during the period, and we can see right now that Rewind Recycling spent a little over $153,000 in material costs, converting this plastic into something that could be used to be made into bins. And they committed $107,610 worth of conversion costs to the recycling of this plastic during the period. And when the period ended, we do have 5,000 units in ending WIP, which means we're still working on them, work in process. And those units are 90% of the way done for the material costs that are going to be incurred to break down that plastic to be made into bins later, and 30% of the conversion costs. So using our weighted average costing method, let's make the PCR for Rewind Recycling's first department. And the first thing we need is the physical units. We got to make sure that we're accounting for all of the units that were within this department during the period. First thing is what amount of units was in beginning WIP. Well, our information up on the top tells us that they've got 4,000 units that were in beginning WIP. And they also started, from our information, 46,000 units in production. So, all in all, taking the 4,000 units that we started with and adding to it the 46,000 that we started in production, during this month of December, the breakdown department had enough plastic they were recycling within this spot to make 50,000 bins worth of plastic. And that's what we need to figure out, where did it end up? Well, the information on top tells us that we transferred out 45,000 bins worth of recycled plastic to be molded, and we're still working on and ending WIP 5,000 bins worth of plastic at period's end. But all in all, if we add those two numbers together, we get 50,000. And so this number is the same as this number. I'll change them to be blue, just as a reminder to everybody in here that they need to match. And they do match. We've accounted for all of the units that we need to um, account for to figure out what portion of these units got transferred, what portion of the units are we still working on. We know where everything lies. Below, we're going to have to figure out, okay, we transferred some units. What amount of cost do we have to transfer with them? And that math is going to be a nightmare if we don't convert this to equivalent units. Equivalent units, as a reminder, is a measure of how many units you could have completed from start to finish for the same amount of cost that you put in to partially complete some units. Well, these units that got transferred out, they have to be done for all of the material and conversion costs of the breakdown department, or we would have not sent this plastic off to be molded into bins. So for the completed and transferred row over here, that is always going to just be the same as your physical units, which means here we've got 45,000 equivalent units for materials and conversion costs, respectively, that we're going to account for the units that we completed and transferred out. But those 5,000 units in ending WIP, they're not done. they're 90% done for materials and 30% done for conversion costs. So let's convert that and say, how many units could we have made the whole entire way for the same amount of cost that it took us to finish 5,000 units, 90% of the way for materials, or 30% of the way for conversion costs? And all you have to do here is take your physical units and multiply it by your percent of completion at period's end. We're 90% of the way done for materials, which means for the same price that we paid in material costs to make 5,000 units 90% of the way, we could have made 4,500 units in full. And then over here for ending WIP, take the 5,000 units, multiply it by the 30% complete they're done for conversion costs, and you get 1,500. So for the same price in terms of conversion costs that we paid to complete 5,000 units 30% of the way, we could have made 1,500 units in full. And now for your total units accounted for over here, in this case, our total equivalent units of production between what we transferred out and the equivalency of what's an ending WIP, that amount of material costs we spent should have been enough to make 49,500 units from start to finish. For conversion costs between what we completed and transferred out and the equivalency of what's an ending WIP, that amount of conversion costs should have been enough to make 46,500 units from start to finish. And with those numbers, we can do the math to figure out, okay, now where do the costs end up? So let's compile our costs first. We had costs committed to beginning WIP at the beginning of the period. Up on the top, our information tells us that the units in beginning WIP already had $19,440 of material costs committed to them. So I'm going to throw that into the material cost column for beginning WIP. Information also tells us that those units in beginning WIP already had $8,640 of conversion costs committed to them. And if you add those two numbers together, you come up with $28,080 that was already in our beginning WIP. Well, what did the breakdown department add during the period? Also provided in the information. The amount of money that the breakdown department spent on materials which were used in production over here during the month of December is $153,810. And the amount of conversion costs that the breakdown department added during the period, combined labor and manufacturing overhead they paid, was 107,610. So add those two numbers together for your total. And in total, just unique to the breakdown department, Rewind Recycling spent $261,420, adding costs to not just the beginning WIP that we had to finish it, but also all the units that we produced in their entirety during the period. So what is the total amount of material costs that we got to account for? We got to figure out how we're going to spread this out. Take what was already committed to the beginning WIP, add to it what you added during the period. We've got $173,250 worth of material costs that we have to account for. Do the same thing for conversion costs. Take what was in your beginning WIP, add to it what you added during the period, and we've got $116,250 worth of conversion costs we need to account for. And then if you add those two numbers together, just like we did above, you've got $289,500 worth of total production costs unique to the breakdown department that we need to account for. And by I mean account for, we need to decide how we're going to spread that $289,500 out between the units that we completed and transferred to be molded, because when units get transferred, the cost gets transferred with them. So what portion of that's going to get transferred to the next department, and what portion of this 289,500 is tied up in our ending WIP. Well, to do that, let's break it down to a per unit basis by dividing those total costs to account for by our total equivalent units of production, which we determined was 49,500 for materials and 46,500 for conversion costs. And if you take your total cost to account for, 173,250, you divide it by your EUP, you get how much on average it costs you for that cost component, in this case materials, to make any one given unit during the period. And here we're going to come up with $3.50. So to break down enough plastic to be made into a bin, the amount of materials that need to be added to break that plastic down is $3.50 per bin. Same thing for conversion costs. We spent $116,250 in conversion costs, which should have been enough to make 46,500 units. So therefore, we can infer that to break down a bin's worth of plastic, we have to pay $2.50 in combined labor and overhead. Now, let's spread it out. Completed and transferred out. How many units, equivalent units, did we transfer out for materials? Well, up on top in this section over here, your number of units, equivalent units that are completed and transferred out for materials is always going to be the same as your physical units, 45,000. We transferred out 45,000 bins worth of plastic to be molded. And we are saying here that each bin costs us $3.50 in materials to break down. So if you multiply those two together, those 45,000 units worth of plastic that we transferred off to be molded had, assumedly, $157,500 worth of material cost in them, and we're going to transfer those material costs when we transfer the physical units. Do the same thing for conversion costs. Our number of units completed and transferred out is 45,000. Each one takes $2.50 of conversion costs to break down enough plastic for that bin, which means those 45,000 bins worth of plastic that we transferred out at $2.50 per bin brings us to a total cost of $112,500 of conversion costs that were in those units that we transferred out. And if we add those two together, we're going to come up with 270,000. So we are saying here that the units that we finished, those 45,000 completed and transferred out units, we're going to assume cost us $270,000 to break down the plastic to be made into the bins. And when we transfer those units to be molded to the molding department, we're also going to transfer that $270,000 worth of cost. But that's not all the cost that we had. Some of that cost has to be tied up in these 5,000 bins worth of plastic that we're still in the process of breaking down when December ended. Same process. What we're going to do is we're going to take the equivalent units through an ending WIP. The amount of cost that we spent to partially complete those units in ending WIP should have been enough to make 4,500 bins worth of plastic in total. And since each bin costs $350, we're going to assume that those units that are in ending WIP have had $15,750 worth of material costs already added to them. For ending WIP over here, we're going to do the same thing. The units that are in ending WIP are only barely completed for conversion costs, but the amount that we have added should have been enough to make 1,500 units in total. And making each unit, each bin worth of plastic to be broken down costs us $250 in conversion costs. So those 1,500 units worth of plastic, we're going to assume costs us 3,750. And if you add those two numbers together, we're going to assume that in total, our ending WIP had $19,500 worth of costs tied up in it when this period ended that we're going to hold here, and it's going to become our beginning WIP for next period. So how much cost did we account for between what we're transferring out and what we're going to assign to our ending WIP? We've accounted for $173,250 of material cost. Between what we transferred out and what we are going to contain in our ending WIP for the breakdown department, we've accounted for $116,250 worth of conversion costs. And if you add those two numbers together, you get $289,500 worth of costs that we've accounted for. And I'm a very happy person right now because this row up here are costs that we had to account for. And this row down here, the costs that we did account for, come out to be exactly the same. And they need to be because if you're missing a dollar here, you're not accounting for all of your costs. Something's different than it should be. But we have, and we've decided here that 270 grand is getting transferred to the next phase of production, while 19,500 here is going to can be contained within the breakdown department at the end of the period and be the value of our ending WIP.